통화들이야 기지 폐기 생계 소식이 소된 수가 믹스에 내린데 체도 지표 간이 장배 비미지 속에 시경 공배마스린 다 소자원 남라 그배 공조 삼지 쉬워다 내림 운수마 쉬고라 공시경 총도다 계실 내림 망배 지진게야 쉔게 달린도 제제기 랭메 단티리 딜랭기 내림들 계실 둔진시라 지네 페토버 먼저 고디 바다 안에 소자와 용네 닌다번에 투전한 쉬에 공을라 내림 태양 공어촌에 깔록 남된다 아니 대제소 어제 뒤에 망와직 소자와 남다 아니 삼자다 도티 여반남 아니 공원염도 컨디션에 어제 뒤지는 같이 샤예 근데 시시하니 어제 내림디 공원하고 좀 쉬어요
Yeah. Tarin Disamso, maybe we'll start with giving you the good news that we managed to restore 7 million US dollar. And Shembatanga mixe shumoche. Most of us, we have already met in different countries wherever I visited. Some of you I have not met. So I think I have provided most of the basic materials whenever I visited different countries. So maybe we keep this session interactive depending on what you want to know. Global politics, China, Tibet, whatever. Whatever I know, I'll share with you. Interactive Shashana, 먼저 파수. Okay. Yeah.
Sikyong chola. Tujina Tangbo VTech member Tangma exception Gadinche. Ani Ni Taring Ama Juzipemala la Tiwajik Tang, Ama Juzipemala, Sikyong Tiwatana, Lane Pejan Yara Resons. Tanda Narangi, Tanda Tondu de la Jagua, Gumsezo, the Ume Lam de Korlanga, Pe Tonanda, Injikleso, Ani Ume Lamda, Ani Ume Lam Gikorni, the Peba di Penal de. Ani Gana Yanji penal deni, ani Pebegi Nang Chedida, Ganagi materialistic advancement dingem do collaborate chinira, Zamlina Shidintu to a Pebanal Raware, Digala advocacy gi Candidojik, Chituna Yashirojik, Tongido, Odi Tuangara.
That Namju Chansu, Tona Nangan, the Imainani, Chengi or Tating a Mangoshu Simbare. 지당기 우멜람시아 그 시주디 중림도지 슈웨이나. If we talk a little bit about the evolution of middle way policy, then we have to go back to 1973. So His Holiness even now says that he started thinking about the middle way policy as early as 1973. So when we say 1973, because I'm very conscious about history. Right? So when you say 1973, what was going on in Tibet, that you have to imagine. Because from 1966 to 1976, there was this 10 long years of cultural revolution inside Tibet, where the Red Army destroyed more than 6,000 monasteries in Tibet, and more than 1.2 million Tibetans died as a direct or indirect result of China's occupation inside Tibet. So when the cultural revolution was going on in the whole of China, and particularly in Tibet and Uyghur and other regions, there was this question, because at that time no Tibetans could go from exiled Tibetans to Tibet, inside Tibet, and no Tibetans could come out of Tibet. So we had a lot of communication gap also, difficulties in obtaining sensitive information from inside Tibet. And then it was an existential problem for the Tibetans, whether we would be able to exist as a people or not. That was the basic question, because so many things were being destroyed. So His Holiness has to be realistic. So as what His Holiness says today, way back in 1973, the Speaker of the Parliament, Tibetan Parliament in exile at that time, raised this question, and His Holiness started thinking about this. But the manifestation of the middle way policy happened only in 1987. So in between There was change in leadership after 1976. Mao Zedong died, and then there was Deng Xiaoping, who took over the political reins of China. And then there was little freedom in the early 80s when you had leaders like Hu Yaobang as the premier of the China, and then you have also leaders like Tsering, who again died in 1989. So they were the leaders whose liberal policies also prompted the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. So 1979, His Holiness elder brother, Gyaltsab Thundup, who died this January, met with Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping said, we can discuss about anything other than independence. Then we sent several fact-finding delegations into Tibet to find out the reality of what is going on inside Tibet. The third and the fourth even could not complete their tour because the Chinese government expected that when the Tibetan delegations came from India to Tibet, they would be not welcomed by the Tibetans, and they kept saying that they are all coming from His Holiness clique and they were, you know, aristocrats before, and they were the ones who were responsible for mistreating you, all those kind of things. But when the delegations reached Lhasa and other parts of Tibet, they were received so well that it went against what the Chinese government wanted. So they stopped, they didn't let the third and the fourth delegation to complete their fact-finding job. Then in 1984 and 86, we tried exploring possibilities for dialogue with China. So we sent two teams one team in 1984, one team in 1986. Then in 1987, because the Chinese government is saying, what do you mean by middle way policy? So His Holiness came out with this 5-point peace proposal, which His Holiness addressed to the United States Human Rights Caucus in the Congress. So at that time, led by Tom Lantos, a former US congressman who is no more with us now. Even now, the Human Rights Commission in the US Congress is named after him, Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So he was living at that time, and he was a big supporter and someone who appreciates His Holiness. So in 1987, at that time, we had very few friends in the US Congress, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. But even then, His Holiness spoke to the Human Rights Caucus and laid out what he meant by middle way on these 5 points. You can look up the 5-point peace proposal. And the 5th proposal is on negotiating with China. So His Holiness expanded on the 5th point in the next year in Strasbourg. That is where the European Parliament meets, sometimes in Brussels, sometimes in Strasbourg, because they have two capitals, and they have to move all the documents to Strasbourg when they meet in Strasbourg from Belgium, from Brussels, and then move back again to Brussels. So His Holiness spoke about the 5th point, negotiating with China. And His Holiness expected that there would be some positive response from the Chinese side, but unfortunately it did not happen. So ultimately, by 1993, when His Holiness spoke at the Yale University, then His Holiness said, now I'm not bound by any of the conditions that I have laid, because China was not responding. And in 1994, His Holiness, 1994, 10th March, His Holiness said for the first time that what direction or what course should we take, should the Tibetans take. His Holiness was asked the Tibetan people to decide what we need to do in future. So we went through a process of collecting opinions from the Tibetans before we embarked on a referendum which was enshrined in the charter. So after finishing the public opinion, we found that about 64.66% of the Tibetans said, considering the global political situation, what's going on inside China, what's going on in Tibet, whatever decision His Holiness takes, we will follow that. So based on that output, the rest of the 34 or 35.3%, we couldn't even segregate because there were too many different opinions at that time. So based on the outcome of that public opinion, without having to go through a referendum process, the result was taken to the parliament in 1997, and the Tibetan parliament in exile passed this with unanimous consent. Okay? So since then, His Holiness reiterated that he will continue with the middle way policy, and we still continue to follow the middle way policy. Now, after we came into this office as Sikyong, after I came into this office as Sikyong, the 16th cabinet, we started thinking about how do we strategize to achieve middle way. So how do we go about this? Because the policy is the same. Just because I am the Sikyong, I cannot change the middle way policy on my whims and fancies. Right? So also the parliament by itself also cannot amend this policy. So in future, if there is a need to change this policy, then we will need to follow a referendum as per the provision of the charter. That is where we are. Now, how the 16th cabinet is explaining middle way to the outside world. This is a strategy that the 16th cabinet has adopted with middle way policy as the main policy, with no change in middle way. Now, how do we achieve this middle way? Because there have not been very positive response from the Chinese side, aside from the dialogue that happened between 2002 to 2010. And once the Olympic was over, then their job was done. The dialogue also stopped. So we could see, with the benefit of hindsight, that Chinese government was using us more for their coming out party, which is the Olympics in 2008. And then once the Olympics is done, they had no use, so they stopped the negotiations. Now, how we try to explain is, when His Holiness says middle way, which in Tibetan is umelam, when we say middle or uma or shung or center, then you are talking about polarities or other ends. Without ends, if you talk about the middle of this table, you see these two ends, right? Without ends, they cannot be middle. So to gain leverage for middle way, to gain value for middle way, we started focusing on getting recognition for the polarities or the ends. Without recognition for the polarities, there is no value for middle way. Now, what are the polarities? Of course, Professor Samdong Rinpoche has defined umelam in many different ways with 8 different polarities, or ends, 2 with 8 ends. Now, I just focus on 2 polarities. One is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. The other is the current situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, right? So these are the 2 polarities. Now, what His Holiness is asking for is a middle way in the form of genuine autonomy. Now, the reason why His Holiness uses the word genuine is because Tibet already has the name autonomy. Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibet Autonomous Prefecture, Tibet Autonomous County, and that extends to the whole of Tibet, Amdo, Kham, Uzang, all of it. Tibet Autonomous Region is more like only majority part of all of central Tibet. So with this objective in mind, it was also timely, because when we came in, there was already the book published by Michael Van Praag. It's called Tibet Brief 2020. Now there is an Indian version which is called Tibet Explained. It's a new title, but it's the same content of the book, right? Now what Michael has done is he has worked for about 6 years with more than 60, 70 scholars from Central Asia, not just from Tibet, and looked at the history of those times from 13th century onwards, because China claims that Tibet is part of China since ancient times, and they go back to 7th century when King Songtsen Gampo had a Chinese consort in the name of Wencheng Kunchu, and Nepalese consort also in the form of Brikuti Devi. So if China is claiming its sovereignty over Tibet just because a Tibetan emperor married a Chinese princess, then Nepal can also have the same claim, because the same emperor had a Nepalese consort, right? So that's not justifiable. when it comes to history, China is on very thin ice. So Michael looked at more from the Yuan dynasty, what China calls as Yuan dynasty. It's only that period when the Mongols invaded China and then it became the Yuan dynasty. For the Chinese historians, the Yuan dynasty is only that period when the Mongols ruled China. So it's between 1271 to 1368, right? And we developed relations with the Mongols much before the Mongols invaded China. So that Chinese claim of sovereignty over Tibet cannot be justified in that sense. So from that time, what was the concept of nation state during those times in Asia, concept of nation states in Africa, Latin America, Europe, everywhere? Because the present day, modern day concept of nation state came only after the Second World War and after the formation of United Nations. What are the criteria you need for a nation state? So all those came much later. So he looked at from 13th century to 20th century, and he proves that whether it is the notion of nation state those days or as per international law today, how Tibet has not been or never been considered part of China. So if you read Michael's book, then you will be in a position, you will feel empowered to argue with anybody else about Tibetan history, because without knowing the past, very difficult to move forward with future, right? So this is one book that I carry with me all the time when I reach out to governments, foreign officers, parliamentarians, and all that. And another book, a very powerful book, which also was published just before we came in, was by this Chinese professor, Lao Hanxiang, who's based in Las Vegas today. And he was a Chinese professor. When he was in his school days, the Chinese government used to teach them, saying Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Then when he reached his university days, then he found that the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government, is asking every other country to say that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. So that really intrigued him as a young man, as a young Chinese, that if Tibet had been part of China since ancient times, then why is the Chinese government asking other governments to say Tibet is part of PRC today? Yeah. And that remained in his mind for a lifetime. And he became a professor. He taught throughout his life, and then he retired. After retirement, he found enough time to download all the historical Chinese imperial historical records from the 13th century till today. And he had written a book which is not in a historical format. This is more an argument as to how Imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. So this is a very powerful argument. That's why Chinese government is not able to respond, because all his research materials are based on, and he has not conferred with or referred to any other history, because the approaches, both the approaches of Michael Van Walt and Lao Hanxiang are different, right? Because he dealt with, Professor Michael dealt with many, Michael and Meek Balthius dealt with many scholars, but he referred only to the imperial Chinese historical records. So these two we carry, and of course then the report of the International Commission of Jurists way back in 1960 is also very useful, because that was very, the history of Tibet was very fresh in their mind, and they looked at it from an international legal perspective. So these are the arguments if you want to really focus on that. The reason why we focus on one polarity, because we keep talking about the current situation in Tibet, whether it's the Central Tibetan Government in Exile, CTA, or non-governmental organizations, everybody does that, right? Whatever news we get from Tibet, we spread it around the world. But the history part, that is the misconception within the Tibetan community, that when you speak about Umelam or Middle Way, then you are not supposed to speak about independent Tibet or, you know, independent Tibet for the future. That is a fallacy. That's very narrow-minded. So we have to be a little more broad-minded, right? And so I have always mentioned 4 reasons as to why we adopted this strategy. 1, is to send a very clear message to the Chinese government that they cannot distort Tibetan history and disinform and misinform the world about Tibetan history. So to say that, we have to understand our own history, right? And the second objective is to the international community. When the whole international community, every country at the behest of the Chinese government keeps repeating the statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, then I tell them you are going against international law. Now you have to compare that with what's happening today in reality. So if you look at invasion of Ukraine by Russia today, and if you look at Chinese invasion of Tibet way back in 1950, that is 76 years ago, it was the same international law. There were no two international laws at that time, and even now, there's only one international law. So if that is applicable to Ukraine, then why it is not applicable to Tibet also? That's the argument I put forward, right? And there's no reply from any governments. Then we also tell them, on the one hand, at the behest of the Chinese government, all governments parrot what the Chinese government wants them to say, that Tibet is part of PRC. On the other hand, they say, okay, we support negotiations between the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. These are the two positions that presently the governments hold. So I tell them these two positions contradict each other. When every government keeps saying that Tibet is part of PRC, then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? Because every government accepts that fact, right? Or rather, the government should be saying Tibet is an occupied state right now. That's more meaningful. That's more clear to the facts, closer to the facts. So we tell them you are removing the very ground for negotiation if there is no recognition for the historical status of Tibet as an independent state, right? So if you argue with reason, then others, it's very difficult to argue back, right? Then the third reason I keep saying is for the Tibetan people, ourselves. If we don't read our own history, then what will we pass on to the next generation? Like my generation today, if we don't understand Tibetan history, we understood a little bit, our generation understood a little bit because we were maybe among the first generations of Tibetans that were born outside Tibet. But the memories were very fresh in our parents and our neighbors and camp people and all that. So even while growing up, we used to hear about Tibet all the time. And if you give a little more attention, then you can read more and more books and understand more in detail, right? So if we have to struggle for another 30, 40, 50 years down the line, this is also one of the reasons why we hold this International Youth Forum, to make sure that we have leadership in the years to come, even if we have to struggle for long, because His Holiness always says, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So we hope for the best that there could be a Sino-Tibet conflict or resolution. When you advocate, speak about Tibet, don't just mention Tibetan issue or Tibet issue, because issue could be between two individuals, two communities, two families, and on a larger level, two nations, whatever. Right? So it can refer to any big or small issue. So to give the right connotation to the dispute, so you call it Sino-Tibet conflict or dispute, because this gives the right status to the context of what we are fighting for, right? And the fourth reason I say is, again, for the Tibetans, that within the Tibetan community, when I was younger, even I used to hold similar position that we should be completely independent. Now, growing up, understanding international politics, understanding what China is doing, what is happening inside Tibet, now you have to be more reasonable. That's how you learn and grow and then frame your mind as to where or what you want to do, right? So, I have always said, we have, I don't know, there is some level of division within the Tibetan community between, let's say, independence seekers and middle way, and we are not able to work together. So this strategy of the 16th cabinet is to bring everybody along, right? And there we are saying, when you go for advocacy work, when you join WeTag and all those, goes for advocacy work. You meet any political leader or media or anybody, first you speak about middle way, why His Holiness adopted middle way, and why it is necessary, why it's important, why it's reasonable, why it is mutually beneficial, as you said, that the Chinese can benefit from us spiritually and we can benefit materially from the Chinese. That is why His Holiness is talking about the mutually beneficial solution. So if by arguing amongst ourselves, if we can resolve the problem, then we can argue for days, till we go hoarse, till froth comes out of our mouth, or till some nerves come strangling out of your forehead or from your neck. I don't know, when people get angry, they do those kind of things. So we can speak, or we can speak till the other person goes deaf, you know. But how much ever you do that, there will be no result whatsoever. That needs to be understood. Right? Nganzo nangkhu joba jarni bhabsa juyona ani rangjen shenge changmalo surji de udan uma shenge changma surji de nganzo joba tabje ani nganzo bhabsa jirago no joba jam digdo. But there's no solution. Think over this. We have to understand the realities, right? So think over this. This will not produce any result. If we all combine our effort together, that's the reason why we started this platform called VTAG, Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group. And I didn't launch this from Dharamsala, I launched this from Zurich, aiming for the younger Tibetans elsewhere around the world. So we see there is no need for division when we go and advocate. So after speaking about middle way, then you can say Tibet was an independent country. I personally want independence for Tibet. My organization is aiming for independence in future. So if you are seeking independence in future, then you have to prove the independent status of Tibet in the past. So this Kashat not just speak about the policy, but worked tirelessly for almost 2 years with the US Congress, both in the Senate and the House of Representatives, and we got this law passed in July last year, which talks about several points. One, China keeps saying there is no Tibet problem. So the law says that Tibet is yet to be a resolved conflict. So it's not yet conflict. And whenever it needs to be resolved, it needs to be resolved under international law. One. Number two, the law says that the Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. Now, self-determination is a term that's enshrined in international law, not autonomy, right? And this is very much in line with the 1961 United Nations resolution on Tibet. We reached out to United Nations in 1950, 59, 61, 65. So this is a part of the UN resolution on Tibet in 1961. Then the third part of this law says that China's disinformation or misinformation on Tibet's history, saying that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, is not accepted by His Holiness, and the US government also does not accept this. So for the first time, we have the most powerful nation in the world, confronting China or countering China on China's disinformation and misinformation on Tibetan history. And then the fourth part of this legislation talks about the territory of Tibet, which is not restricted only to Tibet Autonomous Region, but the whole of Tibet, with all the 3 provinces in it. So we have been reaching out. We managed to get this done. Even for independence seekers, I put up a challenge saying that instead of arguing amongst ourselves, if you manage to convince another country other than the United States, if anybody can do that, I say I will prostrate in front of that person. It doesn't matter to me whether you are independent seeker or autonomy. Anybody who can do that. So my challenge is to put all our efforts together to make sure that governments recognize the independence of Tibet in the past. And now, this time, just last week, I was in London and Berlin, of course, on 2-3 different matters, which we managed to achieve. Maybe we can talk about it later. But one of the objectives of going to UK was to bring in some change to the change in policy they made in 2008 about the sovereignty, suzerainty, all those kind of things. And you are coming from UK. We talked about this a little bit in the last meeting in London. And I have impressed upon the Foreign Office and also the Parliamentary Group for Tibet to work on this. It will not be easy because it was the same Labour government who passed that in the past in 2008. Now you have the same Labour government in UK, and it will be difficult to seek change and review of this, but we will have to keep persisting. I have already sown the seed. Now we have to work towards getting it done, maybe in the next 2-3 years. I don't know whether I'll be there or not. We have a little less than 1 year to go in this term, right? So I hope you got a complete picture about how to explain middle way, seek support. But I have always been saying we have to take two realities into consideration. When we are seeking middle way, then there is no other way than by reaching out to the Chinese government, negotiate with them, and then seek a solution, right? Then the other reality is till such a time, we have to reach out to the international community, whether it's India, UK, America, whatever, and then understand that no nation in this world will leave aside their national interests for the interests of Tibet. That will never happen. That you have to keep in mind. So based on those, our expectations will also be realistic. And if we make our strategic moves, then we can slowly move ahead with what we want to achieve. These two realities. Now, the trick to get this done is you have to understand politics, you have to understand economy, you have to understand security issues, energy issues, all the things that are important in this world today. Not just speak only about Tibet when you go advocate. Make it broader to the Uyghurs, to the Mongols, to the Manchus, include all those, Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, include all those who share the same fate as us. Then go beyond, go into global politics. Now when we meet with European politics, we can speak about European politics to the European politicians. Same also with America. Whichever country we travel, first we have to understand that political system. We have to understand how things work in the two countries, let's say United States and Canada. United States has a presidential system, Canada has a parliamentary system. The two systems are completely different. And you have to find your way around all those to get things done. So understanding US system makes it very easy for us because it's just two political parties. And then we reach out to the Congress, and when you reach out to the relevant committees, like the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, House Foreign Affairs Committee, and if we want funding, then we have to reach out to the appropriators and the appropriation committees in Senate and House. So that's how we go about explaining middle way. Please. Back, Mike.
Sikyong, to just see the material the zo nganzul raira ngajum.
The material 단답하도 페미지주 우때는 파샤베기 냐마 로벤 삼도로 미치 가는 티번낭 백갑레 취리리고 material 열 다디 콘즈데 단데 파일 나노레 룩샤요 송고도와 나 밀웨까지
아니 동댕이 로라서 동댕이 디밍라 동댕이 Sikyong 동댕이 로
history tab there the Michael van Walt van Praag author and Meek Boltius. Meek is M-I-E-K. Meek Boltius. Boltius is B-O-L-T-J-E-S. Meek Boltius. They are the co-authors and they are partners. And their book is called Tibet Brief 2020. And the Indian edition is called Tibet Explained. It must be cheaper, I think, if you buy from the Amazon or wherever in the Indian edition. The other one is in Chinese right now. So only the Chinese version is there. But if you're good in Tibetan, the Tibetan version is available in the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives up in Kangjeng-Kishong. And that was translated by the Chinese liaison officer right now who is based in Geneva. When he was free, he did it on his own to translate the whole book. So the English version we are expecting in a few months because the author doesn't want to make any mistakes because he's challenging China and he doesn't want any small mistakes in the book. So it's taking longer time than what we expected, right? But it should be coming out in the next few months. And once that comes out, then you will have access to that, and that will give you a very powerful argument as to how Tibet is not part of China from the Chinese imperial historical records. Please.